About our subject we've been looking at from Hebrews chapter 12, a great cloud of witnesses. As we press on with looking at this great cloud of witnesses, we're going through chapter 11, and we've made it down to verse 23 and forward. Some of these, in starting off, were quite a challenge, like Abel and Enoch, as far as there being a lot of information about them, but Moses is not like that, is he? There's plenty of information about Moses, and the Hebrew writer even mentions a lot of things about Moses, a lot more than any of the others that are brought up in that chapter. So in Hebrews 11, verse 23, it says, "By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command." I'm not going to do anything on his parents this evening. If you weren't in our Bible class on Jochebed, well, you should have been. And that's where we talked about it. But we talked about the great faith of Jochebed and in particular, and Amram as well. But then continuing in verse 24, "By faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured, as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover of the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians, attempting to do so, were drowned." I'm going to lump that last one in with Moses, even though it mentions all of the Israelites. They were led by Moses, and it would not have been possible without Moses as their leader, I'm convinced. So let's just talk a little bit about all these things that are mentioned. The Hebrew writer is the most prolific when he gets to Moses, and obviously that's for good reason. Most of these first attributes that are mentioned here you can find in Exodus chapter 2. But to capture all the events that he talks about there, you'd have to go all the way through chapter 14 of Exodus. Faith conquering. He refused to be called. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Think of exactly what was involved in that. Pharaoh was the most powerful man in Egypt. Egypt was the most powerful nation in the world. And Moses was in line there to be a part of that royalty. He was drawn out by Pharaoh's daughter. Some think of this particular Pharaoh that she was his only child, but if this Pharaoh is Ramses II, he had nearly 40 children. But Moses, regardless, had a special place in the palace because of Pharaoh's daughter, him being saved by her. And so he owed his life to this princess, did he not? I mean, she could have seen him and saw immediately that he was a Hebrew child and carried out her father's command. But she didn't. And so to know that she drew you out, she disobeyed the king's command, her father's command, and she brought you to health and kept you in the palace, would endear you to her, wouldn't it? And to make a stand for the cause of God and God's people, we need to understand how much Moses was giving up. And how did he do that? The writer says it was by faith. And so you know the degree of faith that he had. He refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter because if he went by that title, he would be giving up the title a son of Abraham. He would be deserting his people and his God and the entire nation of Israel. So he refused to go by that title. Rather, he would be a son of Abraham and lumped in with all of God's people of Israel. And then so you see that he did that. In verse 25, his choice involved some very dire consequences. He choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. So if Moses is going to take his lot with God's people, it's going to be a suffering lot, isn't it? He said, I'm going to make a stand, and I understand that in doing this, I'm not going to have the blessings of the palace, but more than that, I'm going to suffer for a while. The only reason that people are willing to suffer for a while is if there's something better on the other end. Why do people take chemotherapy that makes them sick at their stomach and makes their hair fall out and have all kinds of side effects? Why are people willing to do that? Because they're looking for a great reward from that in having their life spared or their years increased. And that's the reason that people are willing to suffer if they can see some good that's going to come out of it. In Matthew chapter 6 and verses 19 and 20, Jesus encourages us, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. The reason Moses was willing to suffer for a while was because he knew that there would be greater reward later. Peter in 1 Peter chapter 1, beginning in verse 3, offers this blessing to God. Pardon me. And he says that God has begotten us again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. Now listen to this hope that he describes. To an inheritance incorruptible and undefiled and that does not fade away, reserved in heaven for you who are kept by the power of God through faith for salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. This is a principle that Moses understood. He had faith, and that's why he was willing to suffer affliction rather to enjoy the pleasures of sin, because he understood suffering would equal eternal glory, sin would equal passing pleasure. And so as he looked at this, he saw a greater reward for making his lot with God's people. And a true believer in God, when they're faced with a choice like this, they're going to despise what the world offers because it's temporary and it's put at odds with God. Moses teaches us by faith that suffering is to be chosen rather than sin. There's more evil in the least sin than there is in the greatest suffering that we will do to maintain our righteousness. And that's what Moses knew, and that's the life that he lived. In verse 26, it tells us his motive in doing that. He esteemed the reproaches of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. The reward that we just read about, 1 Peter chapter 1. Basically, Moses had a scale, and he put in that scale the worst of what comes in religion, and that is being reproached for the cause of Christ, for the cause of God. And in the other side of the scale, He put the best that this world has to offer, and He weighed them. And what He found was, in that judgment, directed by faith, that the worst thing that happens in religion far weighed down what the best was that the world could offer and was more to be valued. And so that's what He chose. Where Moses conquered the riches of the world by understanding that they're passing and they don't last. And he understood that the reward for serving God and for serving the cause of righteousness was greater than all the treasures in Egypt. Now understand that Egypt was the richest of all the lands at the time. And so he had something to compare indeed. And so when we understand that, we'll be willing to endure reproaches, and we'll have the right attitude toward this world's riches. Remember, Peter says that our reward in heaven does not fade away. All the riches of this earth do fade away. Now think about the time that this happens. If we go back up to verse 24, we talked about the fact that he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. But when does verse 24 say that that happened? It happened when Moses became of age. I think the King James words that when he was come to years. And so not only years so that he had better discretion and that kind of thing, but years of experience and things to compare. In fact, what we're talking about is him being at the age of 40. The reason we know that is thanks to Stephen over in Acts chapter 7 and in verse 23, as Stephen is going through the history of Israel, and he gets down to verse 23 talking about Moses. Now when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. So we get a time signature there. He was 40 years old when he decided to make this stand. This is when he killed the Egyptian who was mistreating the Israelite. And we know it was 40 years after that that he saw God in the burning bush, and it was 40 years after that that he died. So you've got 40 years, 80 years, and 120. And so when he was come to years, as the Hebrew writer words it in Hebrews 11 and verse 24, when he became of age, Stephen tells us that amounts to 40 years old. Now notice that some people, in talking about this, they detract from Moses, that, almost as if to say, well, what took him so long? But I'll tell you what, him doing this at age 40 doesn't detract from him for me. It impresses me. Can you imagine 40 years in the king's palace? 40 years of a relationship with the one who drew you out of the water and saved your life? 40 years. I'm not too much older than that now. And I can't imagine my entire life being devoted to that and then making the decision, I'm going to make a stand, I'm standing with God, and I'm giving up all of this glory and splendor of palace life. He was ripe for discretion, for judgment, and it was at that time that he made this decision. It's a wonderful thing for a person when they are of age to make a decision like this. And to look at Moses having 40 years under his belt of possibly being latched on to the palace life and making this stand. I don't know about you, but that just really impresses me. And it really tells me this was a solid decision with a lot of thought put into it. What was it that supported Moses and strengthened his faith to the point that he was able to do this. Well, again, look at verse 26. He esteemed the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasure in Egypt. How did you do that, Moses? It says that he looked to the reward. Now, some of you have mentioned at various times, the Old Testament says precious little about heaven, doesn't it? And we don't know what was revealed to the patriarchs and to the prophets. We don't know what was revealed to Moses about heaven. But he had faith in a greater reward than this earth had to offer. He had complete faith in that. Now, some will say that verse 26 is referring strictly to the deliverance from Egypt. And granted, that is a great thing, isn't it? To think that generations had been in Egypt, as slaves, and that there's this belief that God is going to deliver His people because He said He was going to. He told Abraham that. He confirmed it with Isaac. He told Jacob that. And the time period was prophesied, and Moses believed that. That's a great thing. But I have to believe that there's more that he was looking to than just being delivered from Egypt. That he was looking to the fact that God was going to provide for him something of surpassing value of this life. Something that surpasses what we deserve and surpasses what we can even imagine in our minds. And that's because the reward that God has prepared, it coincides with the price that was paid for it. And what was that? The blood of His Son, Jesus Christ. That is an incredible reward indeed. And so you and I, if we're going to have the kind of faith that this cloud of witnesses have, Moses in particular, we ought to have respect to, we ought to have a desire to have the reward. We ought to look to the reward. And every day we should delight in the reward, and we should delight in full expectation of receiving the reward. And that way the suffering that goes along with what it takes to obtain it is manageable because we're looking to the reward, having a picture of it. We have also another instance here of his faith in verse 27. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. That's a really interesting verse and concept, isn't it? First of all, he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. Do you see what faith will do for you? To forsake the power that he had access to forsake the pleasures that he had access to, and to undertake bringing Pharaoh's slaves out of Egypt to freedom. That's what faith will do for you. Really, Moses forsakes Egypt twice, doesn't he? The first time he forsakes Egypt as he is supposed to be a criminal. You look back at Exodus chapter 2 and verses 14 and 15, when he's trying to straighten out an argument between his brethren, he said, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" So Moses feared and said, "Surely this thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. And of course, his life went on from there. Moses feared in this matter, in verse 14, but he wasn't afraid necessarily of the king triumphing in all of this. He feared for his life in doing what God would have him to do. And that is a natural reaction. How many times did the Apostle Paul move along in his missionary journeys because people were trying to kill him? You can't do your work if you're dead. And so self-preservation moved Moses on not from a fear of despondency, but discretion to save his life. And the second time that we think about, and let's go back to the verse 27. The second time we think about him forsaking Egypt is as a commander of Israel. Now this time he goes back and he's going to command all of Israel and conduct them out of Egypt. He's going to forsake Egypt. He's going to go back to the place where he was in line perhaps to be king. And he's going to forsake all of that to lead the people out of there. In doing so, he's going to humble Pharaoh, and his faith is going to allow him to do that. It raised him above fear of the king's wrath. Can you imagine being Moses and marching in the first time and saying, God says, let my people go? Now you're going to say this to the king. I can't imagine that first time going in. But after the water turned to blood and then that goes away, and then it's time for the frogs, he goes in again. He says, God says, let my people go. And then the frogs go away and it's time for the lice. And he goes back in and says, God says, let my people go. Can you imagine doing that over and over again after you've just infuriated the king of Egypt? What would allow you to go in there and not fear for your life? The Hebrew writer says faith. And that's why he was able, in Exodus chapter 14 and verse 13, when they stood before the Red Sea and the army of Egypt behind them, apparently no escape route, what did Moses say to the people? Do not be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which He will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall see again no more forever. What allowed him to do that? Faith. He endured. And look at the last part of that statement. He forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. That's a kind of an oxymoron, isn't it? Seeing him who is invisible. How do you see one who is invisible? Moses bore up under all this danger with courage. Why? Because he saw the invisible God. The God with whom we have to do, you and I, is an invisible God. You don't see Him with your eyes. Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7, the way that you see Him is how? By faith. We walk by faith, not by sight. And that's how Moses was able to see Him who was invisible. His faith allowed him to do that. Of course, Moses had a lot closer proximity with the invisible God than you and I. But he still saw the invisible God through the eye of faith. By faith, you and I can see the invisible God as well. And it will enable us as believers to do what God needs us to do today. In verse 28, he says, by faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. I've just got to play a little bit of this for you. I told Bo this morning, I was talking to a fellow this past week who told me about this. I couldn't believe it, and this afternoon I found it, and I just want you to listen to a little bit of this. This is on the Smithsonian Channel, I think just last week.
9,000 feet up, gnarled and twisted bristlecone pines stand contorted against the barren slopes. These are the Earth's oldest living individual trees.
A US team has been able to analyze the tree's annual growth rings with a view to establishing their precise age. They noticed that most of the rings followed a pattern consistent with steady climatic activity, which is why most of the rings are an equal distance apart from one another.
The rings revealed these trees are over 5,000 years old. And they provide a unique record of climate conditions during the tree's long life. But 3,500 years ago, the distance between the annual lines shrinks.
A seismic shift in the pattern is clearly evident here, and the only thing that could have affected it so dramatically is a sudden climatic transformation.
The tree rings, the ancient inscription, and the Bible itself all seem to tell the same story. A terrifying tale of sudden, violent climate change. The question is, what caused it?
Besides a freak event like a meteor crashing into the Earth, for which there is no evidence at this time in history, there's only a very limited number of possible phenomena from the natural world that could cause such dramatic change. And that would be a huge volcanic eruption.
I'm going to stop there. It just floors me that when faced with some evidence that there was a huge atmospheric change at some point about 3,000 years ago, that scientists said, well, we've got to find a thing that would cause that, and the thing that we believe it is a volcano erupted. It can't be what the Bible says, that's for sure. Now, here's the kicker of it, folks. There are no volcanoes in Egypt. So then the scientists proceed to go offshore to a little island, and they found out that a volcano erupted there, and maybe, just maybe, some of that drifted over and started a chain reaction. It fell in the Nile River and turned the Nile red. It killed the frogs. The frogs hatched maggots, which made flies, and so on and so forth. Now, that's the lengths to which people will go to explain away the Bible story and find some natural occurrence that might be an explanation for this. I'm going to tell you something. That's more faith than I've got. That's more faith than Moses has got. Moses had faith in the invisible God that caused all these things. You can look to God and see Him cause this, and then go tell Moses, now go back and tell them, okay, it's over. Moses calls on God, and that's the end of the frogs. That's the end of the lice. That's the end of the flies. It happens just like that. And I want to watch this for one reason. I just want to see how in the world they get that volcano killing just the firstborn people. That is an incredible volcano. And I want to know how it did that. It just blows my mind. Our statement is, Moses kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. Now, just like people say, how does baptism get you to contact the blood of Christ? Wouldn't you say, how does putting blood from sheep on my doorpost and the thing over my window, how does that keep death from coming to me? I mean, is there any correlation between lamb's blood and life? Or not having lamb's blood and death? Is there anything that these scientists from Chicago could come up with that would be a correlation there? God said to do this, and that He would preserve life. And Moses did that. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7, Paul urges those at Corinth to purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. Christ is our Passover. Christ is our Lamb. In fact, when John the Baptist saw Jesus for the first time, as he was walking toward him, how did John introduce him? Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. He is our Lamb. Jesus' blood must be sprinkled in order to have life and to avoid death. It's through His blood. Romans chapter 6 talks about how we are baptized into His death. That's where we go and get the blood. It only applies to those people who align themselves with God and choose God. And it has nothing to do with our own righteousness or us deserving it. It's simply by being obedient to God's commands, just like it was for those in Goshen that night. Wherever the blood is, that soul is going to be spared because of their faith. And that's the way it is for those who have faith in Christ. And this true faith makes sin a bitter thing to us that we despise. And all of the privileges that we have on this earth, we have those because of the blood that we've had access to. And then in verse 29, the last thing that's mentioned there is passing through the Red Sea. We made some reference to that in this morning's lesson. You can read about that in Exodus chapter 14. The Israelites were preserved in this passage because of faith. Moses told them, "Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord." He said, "You see those Egyptians back there, you'll never see them again forever." And he held out his staff, and God parted the waters by faith. Israel's danger was very great. They would either be killed by soldiers or drowned by the sea, and God delivered them. Their deliverance was glorious. You know, they were delivered in glorious fashion. The waters didn't just part and they wade their way through the slime and the muck, but they walked over on dry ground. That's an impossibility, isn't it? If you've seen water dissipate, you know the ground stays saturated for a long, long time. And yet God gave them dry ground and they passed through. But here's the thing, you can only pass through on the dry ground by faith. And what happens is, when faithless Egyptians try to do the same thing, they can't. They're not a part of the people of faith, and so their ruin was a grievous ruin. When God judges, He overcomes evil in a glorious fashion. And the destruction of sinners is plain so that everyone can see. And that's what took place there. By faith, they, the Israelites, led by faithful Moses, passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, no differently than if they had walked across the desert. And the Egyptians, without their faith, were drowned as they tried to duplicate what these did. Well, remember that chapter 12 tells us that we are to lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and run with endurance the race that's set before us. We're to be aided in doing that by looking at the faith of all of these men and women in chapter 11. And Moses is certainly one of the highlights of that hall of fame of faith. He just leads the way. And so as we look to God in faith, let's remember Moses and his incredible display of faith when he certainly had ample opportunity to let things weigh him down and let sin keep him from accomplishing all these great things. And may it help us to be men and women of faith ourselves. If there's one here this evening and your life is not right with the Lord, and there are changes you need to make, if we can help you in making those changes, or you just want to talk about where you are in your life, however we can help you, please let your needs be made known right now while we stand and
Sing the wondrous song of Jesus.